Hello, my name is Francesca Maisano. I'm a senior historic preservation major and a lifelong Catholic. I'm here today to talk to you about an individual study, Catholicism and preservation. So the topic of my individual study is the reason behind the choices the Catholic Church and the United States makes when it comes to the preservation of historic structures. The methodology I followed to complete this study was to first compile a list of case studies and then talk to dioceses and parishes later the case studies to get more information if needed. I then compared and analyzed the case studies. As to my results, I found that the choices made and the reason behind them varied depending on who the decision maker is within the hierarchy of the church, which was further affected by the different priorities each group values, how closely connected they are to the structures involved, and by underlying trends in the demography of Catholics in the United States. At the top of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church is the Pope and the Cardinals, the Vatican. So here are the Vatican level laws and guidelines relating to the preservation of historic structures and sites. First is canon law, the law of the church. Canon law states that churches must be maintained in a state of cleanliness and beauty. If they cannot be used for worship, churches can be closed and sold for profane but not solid use. That means that churches cannot be sold or used for uses that run contrary to Catholic belief. In addition to churches, canon law also talks about cemeteries, and that one must protect and foster the sacred character. In addition to the canon laws, there have also been guidelines. Such as these guidelines, which are called Guidelines to Decommission and Inclusive Reuse of Churches, which was made at a conference in 2018. These guidelines argue for the reuse of churches for the sake of cultural heritage, social inclusion, and the safeguarding of creation. So overall, at the Vatican level, laws and guidelines dictate and argue for the preservation and reuse of churches. However, one thing to take note of is that neither canon law nor these guidelines mention non-sacred structures. This makes sense, as the officials and workers of the church care far more about the mission of the church, which is the salvation of souls, than the preservation of its structures. The property the church owns is just a means to the end for this mission. It's the only distinction to be made, property which the church considers to be holy and therefore special meaning. The next one on the hierarchical ladder is the bishops and dioceses. The bishops and dioceses are particularly important when it comes to preservation, as oftentimes it's the dioceses and bishops that legally own the property, and therefore are the decision makers when it comes to selling and destroying historic structures. Now, in theory, American bishops should be pro-preservation, as they've made guidelines called Built Living Stone on the building and renovation of places of worship, which is very pro-preservation. And in addition to stressing the importance of historic structures, communities, and the history, the guidelines also advocate for numerous preservation-friendly actions. For example, the guidelines dictate that when renovating churches, one should preserve as much of the original building fabric as possible. In addition, the guidelines also say that the diocese should document cultural heritage. So, however, while the guidelines are for preservation, in practice, bishops' approach to preservation may be different. I like to call their approach detached practicality. They are not typically swayed by personal connections to structures or by sentimentality, but by financial reasons because they want to enable the church to continue to perform its mission. For example, despite the parishioners wanting to keep St. Vincent de Paul Church open in Manhattan, the church pictured on the left here, the church was closed and sold, leading to destruction. The church was sold as the diocese claimed that the dwindling number of parishioners could not support the church, and that the church was in poor condition. However, there is actually some variation between bishops and dioceses when it comes to preservation. For example, in Illinois, a bishop formed an association run by parishioners that would pay and care for a historic church that had been closed to save money. However, in Pennsylvania, a different bishop refused to allow a society full of parishioners to care for a church in much the same way. This church is St. George, still right here, citing that it would be infeasible. In addition to this variation between when it comes to sacred structures, there's also variation when it comes to non-sacred structures, like schools and homes. While sometimes they may preserve these places of cultural heritage without the need for extensive lobbying efforts, they also place the preservation of these non-sacred structures as less important than their own plans and missions. For example, the Diocese of Rockford, Illinois, restored its historic chancery, citing cost, safety, and building code concerns. The diocese resisted attempts by preservationists to limit the building, claiming for other reasons that the designation would inhibit the diocese's mission in serving the entirety of its 11 county diocese, and not just one neighborhood. Then underneath the diocese are parishes which serve priests and parishioners. Priests, like bishops, may also come from a place of practicality. For example, when talking about the destruction of his now former church, one priest said, "In my heart, I really feel that the land does have sentimental value to so many people, but sentimentality does not pay the bills." However, priests may also play a part in preserving their churches. For example, in the mid-20th century, the priest of St. Gabriel Archangel Catholic Church in Louisiana, pictured the upper right here, knew that the parish needed a new church, but thought that the late 18th century church should also be preserved. So, a new church was built next door, while the old church was preserved. On the other hand, away from the practicality and economics approach, when it comes to the choices parishioners make, by and large, they tend to be moved by emotion, mentality, and connection. They cite emotional, cultural, and community connections, as well as historical and architectural reasons for preservation. When they talk about their churches, some phrases they might use are beloved landmark and a second home. They may fight against the diocese to save their church, like in the cases of St. George and St. Vincent de Paul. They will also care and preserve for the buildings. For example, parishioners paid for the repair maintenance of St. Paul Catholic Church in Portsmouth, Virginia, is pictured to the left on this screen. However, even at the parish level, non-sacred structures can face trouble if the building conflicts with parish economics and mission. For example, in Washington, D.C., Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, a national shrine, which is a national shrine, not a parish, but still an individual church and not a diocese, so kind of here, planned to demolish the Heber Lodge or Heber Gatehouse, pictured at the bottom right here, which is the first structure in D.C. that was built in the Second Empire style. It planned to do this because it claimed to be cost competitive as well as the plan's property to preserve it. However, after preservation lobbying and efforts, Basilica eventually withdrew its demolition permit and did not oppose it to D.C. landmark nomination, which was approved. So that was the overall situation in the United States. But how does the Diocese of Arlington compare? Well, looking at the preservation-related issues, there appears to be less of them in this diocese. One of the situations that seem to be accompanying much of the preservation problems related to the church in the United States is parish mergers, where two parishes become one, and oftentimes one of the parish churches is sold. However, there's only been one parish merger in this diocese, happened in 2002. Therefore, historic churches have not really been sold in this diocese. Instead of selling or tearing down old churches, the diocese has instead been building new churches. In addition, when a historic church becomes too small, often the diocese builds a new larger church, retaining the previous one for other purposes. For example, in the parish of St. John the Baptist in Front Royal, Virginia, built a new church right along its old church, which can be seen in the upper left-hand picture. And another example is the Sacred Heart Parish in Manassas, whose 1937 chapel is still used for daily mass. And you can see that in the upper right-hand corner. Then in terms of the historic churches the diocese has, including these churches, including ones that are currently used as the main church, the parishes have been taking care of them. For example, when I visited the Basilica of St. Mary and the cemetery, the picture at the bottom two pictures, I found them both to be clean and well kept. In addition to preservation, the parishes have also been caring for the churches through restoration. For example, in Woodstock, the St. John the Evangelist Hall, a former church and now church hall, was restored in 2019 back to its original appearance through the use of archival photographs. The restoration was driven by the parish's former pastor, who it was very important to him that the church was restored to looking like a church. The parish of the diocese also have shown the appreciation of historic church architecture and heritage through the reuse of items from demolished churches around the country. For example, the Church of Our Lady of Hope in Potomac Falls, built 2003-2006, is not an old church, and is pictured at the top right here, features many reused items and materials. There's a marble reredos from behind the altar, from a convent from near Buffalo, New York, and an altar in the altar itself from a former church in Philadelphia. However, while there have been some preservation success in this diocese, in terms of sacred structures, non-sacred buildings have fared more poorly in this diocese, just like overall. For example, in Fredericksburg, the oldest house in the College Heights neighborhood, was torn down, as according to Andrew Schulman, the director of the Diocese's Office of Planning, Construction, and Facilities, claimed that a cost-effective adaptive reuse for the structure could not be identified with sound emission. However, there also has been some preservation success related to non-sacred structures. For example, in Leesburg, the St. John the Apostle Parish was a local venerable an award for the treatment of the Babson Estate and Workshop well, located on its property, especially that the parish now uses as a chapel during burial ceremonies at its cemetery. So evidently, based on the lack of parish mortgages in church sales, and the care that the parishes have been able to afford to give to their churches, the Diocese of Arlington has not been struggling like other dioceses. In fact, the diocese has been growing. In 1974, when the diocese became a separate entity from the Diocese of Richmond, and when I had 49 parishes and 7 missions and 136,000 parishioners, it has grown to include 70 parishes, 6 missions, and 143,000 parishioners. And this growth actually correlates to the demographic trends in the United States when it comes to Catholics. Prior to World War II, in the 19th and early 20th century, Catholics lived predominantly in the cities in the Northeast and Midwest, and these Catholics were large part were immigrants from Europe, such as Ireland and Italy. However, post-World War II, the descendants of these immigrants have been moving to suburbs in the South and West, causing the parishes they left up north and in the Midwest to lose funding, which then causes the parishioners to be merged and the churches to be sold. However, because the Diocese is in the South and is of a suburban parish, it has been affected the opposite way. So in conclusion, the approaches and choices the Catholic Church makes when it comes to the preservation of the built environment vary between members of the church hierarchy, depending on where their priorities and values lie. There's also variation within the structures themselves, formed by individuals' own interpretations of feasibility and practicality, and their own understanding and appreciation of the importance of preserving historic structures. Finally, the approach and choices also vary between sacred and non-sacred structures. For sacred structures, the cultural emphasis and default is on the preservation of sacred structures, with economic factors being a primary influence behind the choices to contrary, and anti-preservation choices typically being only occurring when it's deemed needed and not and hard and difficult otherwise. So non-sacred structures appears to be the opposite, where they may be destroyed not because of the lack of money, but because of enough money and that the church wants to grow. Ultimately, and unfortunately, these preservation issues described in this presentation, both for sacred and non-sacred structures, are not new but ongoing issues that have been happening for decades. It remains to be seen what the impact of COVID-19 would have on diocese parishes and preservation once the pandemic is over. I should note the trends I talked about in this presentation on the United States and on its diocese were pre-COVID. However, regardless, so being able to understand the reasons behind why those in the Catholic Church make the decisions that they do, preservationists can better work with those members of the church for the preservation of the church's historic structures. Thank you for listening. And here are my picture citations, if you're curious.